herramientas, en las pensiones, en todos los derechos sociales.
And so with that conversation being started, students started questioning the role of capitalism and the free market in other spaces in their lives, of healthcare, of housing. It wasn't just about education and their parents' pensions.
Eso permite también que empiecen a surgir otros movimientos sociales en el país y que también los estudiantes adoptaran un rol de articular también y de apoyar también esas otras luchas.
And so the student movements shift in the sense that they also start becoming supportive back and forth with other social movements that were going on in the country.
Gracias a las movilizaciones se han podido tener varias ganadas como gratuidad a un cierto sector de la población o ciertas becas para estudiar en la educación superior.
So as a result of the student movements, there's been various victories. Certain places have had access to a free education, and we've also been able to win some scholarships, more scholarships for students.
El 2018 fue un año importante también para el movimiento estudiantil, tanto por la movilización feminista que se da en el país.
2018 was also important for the student movements, mainly because of the surgence of a feminist movement that also takes storm in the country.
Pero también porque fue un año en donde la represión hacia los estudiantes se vio agudizada, estando un gobierno también de derecha en el poder.
And also because the amount of repression that came was mainly coming from a right-wing government.
Uno de los elementos importantes que pasa ese año es que carabineros entran a los liceos de los estudiantes, se suben a los techos, entran a las salas a sacar a los estudiantes que se movilizaban.
One of the things that was different about that year is that the amount of repression changed, that the police started going into the schools, grabbing students out of their classrooms, going on the rooftop of the schools, getting through the fences.
Y eso, la represión hacia los estudiantes ha sido histórica, pero cada vez iba aumentando más y la criminalización es cada vez mayor hacia los estudiantes y hacia los movimientos sociales en general.
So while we know that the repression has always happened against student movements, the repression was getting worse, and at the same time it was getting worse not only for student movements, but for student movements in general, for other social movements in general. And what was also happening was a criminalization of the students who were protesting.
Y en 2019 lo que ocurre es que hay un anuncio por parte de las autoridades de subir el pasaje del metro 30 pesos.
So in 2019, there's an announcement by the authorities that the metro, the price of the train fare, is raised by 30 cents.
A los estudiantes no nos afectaba porque nosotros tenemos una tarjeta en particular que no nos subía el precio del pasaje del metro en general.
As high school students, we weren't affected by it because we have a student high school pass.
Pero sí le afectaba a nuestras mamás, a nuestros papás, a los trabajadores en general del país.
But we were clear that who was affected by this was our parents, our father, our mother, and the workers of the country.
Y fueron los estudiantes secundarios quienes se organizaron y fueron a evadir el metro, no solo como en forma de protesta, sino que también para dejar pasar gratis a la gente.
And so it was the high school students who decided to protest this by doing protests of mass evasion. So for folks that, if you can imagine, mass evasion is literally hundreds of students jumping the turnstile, and not only jumping the turnstile simultaneously in mass, but also at the same time opening the doors so that workers and everyday people going to work could get on the train for free.
Eso duró durante 2 semanas y ya el 18 de octubre del 2019 se da una gran movilización en donde se queman muchos metros y en donde se corta la conectividad de todo el país.
And so that was going on for about 2 weeks, and the explosion of this whole protest came on October 18th, 2019, when the protest just reached a higher level. There was metros, train stations that were burned, the train system was cut off, and in many ways, the transportation to, in and out of the city was cut off as well.
Y ya desde ese día y a los próximos la movilización se expandió y ya no eran solo por esos 30 pesos que habían subido, sino que ya era por una rabia acumulada y por demandas que tenían que ver con la precarización de la vida en general.
And so by the next day, the protests had spread from the capital to being nationwide, and the demands were no longer about 30 cents, but it was about like some of the students said, about 30 years of a post-dictatorship moment in which folks were fighting literally just for a better life in general.
La primera respuesta y la que se mantuvo durante mucho rato fue desplegar a los militares en las calles del país.
The response of the government was to put out the military against the people. They sent the military out to the streets, which hadn't happened since the dictatorship.
Y ahí, bueno, ocurrió lo que ocurre cuando despliegan a los militares en el país, que es que hubo muchos muertos, muchos presos políticos, mucha gente le dispararon en los ojos y por tanto hay muchas personas con trauma ocular.
So what happened was what happens when you send out a military into the streets. You have many protesters that were murdered, killed on the streets. You had people that were shot and in the tactic of shooting out their eyes suffered ocular trauma as well. And you had injuries all across the board because of the military. Many people arrested and who are today still political prisoners.
Y así fue que se fue desarrollando la protesta durante alrededor de 3 meses, hasta que llega enero del 2020, la protesta ya estaba un poco más decaída.
And so this protest lasted for about 3 months. And so next, the protest, while they were losing a bit of energy in January of 2020,
se iba a realizar una prueba que es la prueba que se hace todos los años para ingresar a la educación superior, que es una prueba que históricamente se ha cuestionado por el movimiento estudiantil, por su lógica estandarizada y segregadora, en donde los estudiantes que tienen mayor acceso económico pueden tener mejores resultados en esta prueba porque estudian en colegios mejores y quienes no pueden hacerlo.
And so around that time of the year is when the high school students have to take an exam by the name of the PSU, which is the equivalent of maybe here like an SAT or an ACT, which is a standardized test for them to get into college or into institutions of higher learning. And their problem with it, and there's, I'm throwing this in just because there's parallels here, like some of the protests against standardized testing here in education was that it was a test that was geared for students who have had more access to higher resources in education to fare better off than students that haven't had a properly funded education. And so they protested against this in January 2020.
Entonces hubo ocupaciones de liceo, hubo masivas movilizaciones para que no se realizara esta prueba y para que se cambiara. Y en ese proceso también se dio represión, pero también se dio un nivel como de necesidad por parte del poder de responder a esta movilización porque fue muy grande.
And so the mobilizations were very large. Students took over. In Chile, it's a common tactic for high school students. They call them tomas. They literally take over the school and barricade themselves in it. They put chairs by the doors. And so there were schools that were taken in toma, that were taken over. There was protests. And the government once again came with a very strong repression of these students.
Allí una de las tácticas que se utilizó fue invocar Ley de Seguridad Interior del Estado, que es una ley que se invoca cuando el Estado está en peligro, y se le invocó a varios dirigentes estudiantiles y personas que fueron detenidas durante la protesta.
And so during these intense moments of protest, the government put out the ley of so they put out a law that was called for internal security of the state, which is a law that's usually used when there's a moment of war going on, and they placed these charges on various high school student leaders.
Esta ley permite que hayan condenas mayores o que puedan ir y detenerte y encarcelarte.
These type of laws open up the window to receive further criminal charges, and at the same time gives them the green light to go and detain you.
Pero por el nivel de apoyo social que hubo, se aplicó, se puso, pero nunca se aplicó la ley.
And because of the strong, immense amount of social support that we had, the law was implemented, but they never used it against us.
Y bueno, esa fue una de las últimas movilizaciones grandes porque en enero, febrero, en Chile es verano y hay vacaciones.
And so that was the last of some of the larger protests. In Chile, they have summer vacation in January and February, so it was a low point for the protests.
Y en marzo, cuando estaban volviendo a clases, hubo de nuevo movilizaciones, evasiones de metro, ocupaciones de las escuelas, pero llegó la pandemia.
And so when March came, we went back to classes and the protests continued. The mass evasions continued, the school takeovers continued, but then they got hit with the pandemic.
Bueno, y la pandemia, la cuarentena llegó de una, solo se podía salir a comprar 2 veces a la semana y con un permiso especial, no había forma de salir a la calle.
And in Chile, they used the pandemic to implement a very strong quarantine in which people could only go outside 2 times a day to go shopping, which made it impossible to continue organizing.
Sin embargo, igual en la pandemia se dieron protestas sobre todo por la necesidad de ayudas económicas porque había mucha gente que no podía trabajar o mucha gente que perdió sus trabajos.
Yet during the pandemic, the protests that did happen, many of them were for demands for more economic resources and because of hunger in the communities.
Bueno, la lucha continúa hasta el día de hoy, sobre todo por la violación a los derechos humanos que se dio en ese momento y porque se generó un grado de impunidad importante para los pacos que en ese momento y militares que ejercieron violencia en ese momento.
And so today the struggle that does continue mainly is for the violations of human rights that happened during those moments. And not only that, against the police and military who committed those violations of human rights, who today have impunity and have not been charged with anything.
Y al final ese es el vínculo que hemos podido establecer y hemos podido concluir con diversas experiencias que hemos adquirido en el viaje aquí a Estados Unidos.
So from some of the experiences that we've been able to connect with folks on the various trips that we've made here in this country so far.
Que la lucha antirrepresiva es un elemento clave también, que es transversal a las diversas luchas sociales que han llevado adelante los pueblos en los últimos años.
That the amount of human rights violations via police repression is something that is across the board in social struggles here in the U.S. as well as back home for us.
Hay que entender que tanto acá como en Chile, como en general en Latinoamérica y el mundo, la policía es el brazo armado de la mafia que es el poder a nivel internacional.
And so we're clear that on an international level, the police is the armed thugs of the mafia that run this whole capitalist system on an international level.
Y que en los momentos donde ven cuestionados sus privilegios, ven cuestionados sus formas de explotar la tierra y a las comunidades y a las personas.
And when they see their privileges questioned and the way that they exploit the land and people questioned,
deciden optar por la violencia más brutal para callar a los pueblos que están en resistencia.
They choose to practice the worst form of violence in order to silence the people that are protesting against them.
Y ese también es el problema que nos explicaban con Cop City, ¿no? Que es un avance en la militarización.
And this is the same problem that we understand was explained to us as what is Cop City, which is an advancement in the militarization of police.
Pero que también es un atentado claro contra las comunidades, contra los espacios naturales que tenemos a lo largo de nuestro país.
And it's also an attack on the natural resources that you have in this country, the same way that our natural resources in the name of the forest in our country are being attacked.
Entonces es Cop City acá, pero en Chile también tenemos la experiencia con que arrasando bosques bosques naturales se instalan monocultivos para explotar la tierra y asesinarla.
And so while here you have Cop City in Chile, we see a lot of our forests being chopped down and replanted with monocultivation, which are pines, and we see that our land is also being destroyed.
Entonces hay que entender que en diferentes contextos y con ciertas diferencias mínimas, en el fondo la lucha es contra el mismo enemigo y se da en contextos parecidos.
And so we're understanding, and we understand that the struggle, while it may be different in different contexts, we're clear that we're fighting a common enemy.
Y entonces eso, muchísimas gracias por la invitación, por permitirnos estar acá y aprender de su lucha.
Thank you so much for allowing us to be here and learning about your struggle.
Esperamos que se haya entendido parte del contexto que se vivió en Chile y que se sigue viviendo, la lucha contra la represión, contra la impunidad, pero también por mejores condiciones de vida para la clase trabajadora.
And so we hope you understand in the context that we shared our stories about the struggle for Chile and the struggle for better living conditions for the working class, for the community and for the people.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much.